So hello everybody, and welcome to Gaia Education's Glocalisers webinar series. My name is Giovanni Charlo. I am the academic coordinator for Gaia Education, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's much anticipated webinar entitled Pathways to Prosperity, Turning Around the Global Economy. Gaia Education works to build capacity and whole systems design, unleashing the emergence of local solutions to global challenges. You may find some of our other products also quite informative in your exploration of sustainability and regenerative work and lifestyles. Please check out our publications available at our online shop and translated into several languages around the world, including teaching manuals and books with essays and topics of interest to all of you studying sustainability and regenerative systems. There is also a set of cards. These are flashcards that we have designed for community implementation of the UN's Agenda 2030. This Agenda 2030 is endorsed by over 190 countries, and it's beginning to make some dent in the sustainability movement around the world. We also run Design for Sustainability courses online all year long, and in three languages. You can follow our global community of learners through the various social media channels shown on the screen. Please also check our website about joining our roster of certified trainers by following Gaia Education's learning journey. In this free webinar series, we offer you the chance to meet some of Gaia Education certified trainers, such as Russ Jackson and Jonathan Dawson, who have been working with us for a long time, of course. The certified trainers also are known as Glocalisers because they work both globally and locally in their communities. This webinar is offered in partnership with Schumacher College and will take the form of a moderated conversation between leading experts in the field of economics and transformation, social transformation particularly. At the end of the webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, and you can post those questions in the chat box, which you can see at the bottom of the Fuse application that you are in at the moment. Let me say a word about our presenters. We have, first of all, Russ Jackson, who is the chairman and founder of Gaia Trust, a charitable organization based in Denmark. Russ has a background in physics, management, and economics, specializing in operation research. He has published many books on a variety of subjects, including Occupy Wall Street, We Are Doing It, and Building an Eco-Village Future. Russ has worked in various branches of businesses and finance. Jonathan Dawson is a sustainability educator currently working as head of economics at Schumacher College in the UK. He was a long-term resident of Findhorn Eco-Village in Scotland and a former president of the Global Eco-Village Network. He has over 20 years of experience as a researcher, author, consultant, and project manager in the field of small enterprise development in Africa and South Asia.
Let me just add, Ross and I have also co-authored a book together with Henry Norbert Hodge called Gaia.
Yes, thank you for that, Jonathan. Indeed, there are many books that both Ross and Jonathan have published, some of them together, I guess, at least one. And I encourage our public to look for those books. They are indeed very interesting and relevant to the topic at hand today. So today's session will be moderated by Naresh Giangrande, one of the founders of the Transition Network. Naresh also set up and coordinated the Energy Group of Transition Totnes in the UK and was director of Transition Town Totnes. He has spoken widely at conferences and public events globally. So let's get started with today's conversation. I'm sorry, you can see our presenters, but I also have some slides where they look quite handsome and interesting indeed. Let's get started with today's conversation. I turn the room over to our distinguished guests and to Pathways to prosperity. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Giovanni. That's lovely introduction. And I'm looking forward to today's dialogue, Pathways to Prosperity, Turning Around the Global Economy. We have about an hour. It should be enough time. So let's get stuck in. Our starting point today is that we feel that we're way past the point of tinkering with the current system, and that our starting point is that we need deep systemic change. Johann Noah Harari, in his book Homo Deus, has put it quite well, I think. He says, humankind finds itself locked into a double race. On the one hand, we feel compelled to speed up the pace of scientific progress and economic growth. 1 billion Chinese and 1 billion Indians want to live like middle-class Americans, and they see no reason why they should put their dreams on hold when the Americans are unwilling to give up their SUVs and shopping malls. On the other hand, we must stay at least one step ahead of ecological Armageddon. So, with that cheerful note as a starting point, we thought we'd examine this particular area today. We're not going to go, I don't think, too much into the ecological crisis that we're facing, but instead, let's face head on this the major concern we have about how we're going to turn around the global economy and make it into something that both respects Earth limits, but then provides a decent living for all, social and political and economic equality. And we felt that this dialogue might center around three particular areas. So the first is that what are the stories? What are we seeing emerging in the new economy? Where are the leverage points starting to appear and be exploited? And then we're going to move on to something about strategies, successes and failures. What are the strategies being employed in different areas and in different parts of the globe? And also, lastly, maybe exploring some of the larger scale systems, like particularly the monetary and financial system, and what can be done to replace or transform them. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for a bit of question and answer. So, Ross, kick us off. What do you like to say about this particular topic?
Well, I think a good place to start would be to discuss one thing which I think is going to be dominating the whole economic situation in the next decade or two, and that is the fact that solar energy now has become cheaper than fossil fuel energy. And this is something which has happened very, very recently. For example, in California, which is one of the leaders in this area, about 80% of all new energy investments are in the area of solar energy. And I think this is a trend which is going to be accelerating. As solar energy becomes used more and more, it's going to become cheaper and cheaper, and it's going to have major implications for the whole energy structures. Because one of the things about solar energy which is important here is the fact that it is not something which has economies of scale. It's something which is very decentralized. And this is going to have a major impact on the way in which we organize ourselves. For example, in more remote areas of every country, it may be possible in a few years for these areas to be totally self-sufficient in energy production with solar panels on every roof and heat pumps being run by the electricity. And I think this is going to have one of the major factors which we'll be seeing evolving in the coming years.
Great. Thank you. Jonathan, what have you to say to us this afternoon as well?
This is like some framing comments for the.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Ross, you can't hear me. Can you hear me, Ross?
Evidently not. Giovanni,
hear anything?
Giovanni, is Jonathan available to the participant?
I can hear Jonathan fine, but evidently Russ cannot. Can you hear Russ?
Ross, can you hear anybody?
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you, Russ. Can you hear us?
My sound is gone.
Can you hear us? No. So sorry about this. let's see. Russ, if you unplug your headphones and use your computer speakers.
Now I can hear you for some reason.
Okay.
Good.
Did you hear me all right?
I can hear you, Ross. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I want to make some introductory comments, and it's very much about framing the whole discussion. I think that sometimes the assumption is made, the implicit assumption is made that in some sense the global economy isn't working. It's not functioning. In some way it's broken and we need to fix it. And I want to challenge that assumption because it seems to me that the global economy is working perfectly for the purpose for which it is designed. In other words, the rules of the global economy are set in such a way as to maximize production by private corporations for the benefit of distant shareholders. And it's doing that perfectly. So in other words, this is not a question of, as you said at the beginning, Naresh, of tweaking and somehow correcting errors in the system. It's rather about challenging what is the purpose of the system in the first place. And it seems to me that we have a system at the moment that is excluding critical stakeholders, particularly future generations, other than human species and poor people. And consequently, I would say that the global economy is currently working perfectly for the purposes for which it is designed. And so rather than looking to see how can we correct a system that is malfunctioning, I think the question is how do we redesign the purpose of the economy in the first place so that it's actually serving a different purpose. Maybe just one other, I hope that makes a bit of sense. The one other introductory comment I would say is that I teach a 1-year master's program here at Schumacher College called Economics for Transition that's very much looking to natural design principles, the design principles of other than human systems, complex adaptive systems. And in this exploration of what would a transitional pathway look like to an economy that is regenerative and that is serving a more helpful purpose, namely human and other than human flourishing, what can we learn from the design of other than human systems? So it's very much the application of systems thinking and particularly understanding how natural other than human systems self-organize and how can we integrate those better into the design of the human systems. So that's how I'd introduce the subject in the first place.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that's a timely reminder and an important reminder that the system actually is working perfectly for what it's designed for. And to think that it's going to do anything differently until we change the system parameters or the system design then is really wishful thinking. So what do we see emerging? Because that's one of the things about the current economy is that it's always changing. There is always new ways of doing business as well as new businesses. And as Ross mentioned, there's disruptive technologies such as solar that are constantly changing the social, political, economic landscape. What are we seeing in this new emergent economy? Jonathan, do you want to, can you speak to that?
So I think it's a useful imaginative exercise to try to imagine oneself to be an historian of the near future looking back to this moment in history and trying to write, like, what will the history books look like that are written in 2030, 2040? And when I do that, you know, trying to track, like recognizing that almost everything that's on the front page of the newspaper will be footnotes at best in those history books. What are the critical tectonic plates that are shifting underneath at the geological strata level that have the potential to fundamentally change the nature of our societies and economies? And when I do that, it seems to me that the headlines that the historians of the near future will pinpoint as being associated with the era in which we live are either that we lost control of the climate and we lost control of biophysical systems, and actually it was the beginning of a very steep decline into anarchy, or that it was a period where we lived through the transition from centralized organizational forms to distributed organizational forms, much more democratic. So I think, for example, Ross, you're talking about energy. I think there's two really interesting dimensions about the energy revolution. One is that it enables us to leave fossil fuels behind. The other is that it enables the emergence of much more distributed systems rather than centralized systems. So every previous energy form has been physically, geographically concentrated in one area, favoring the capitalist mode of production, which brings the capital to one particular place. Whereas in the case of renewable energy, and this is not just in energy, I think we could look through every sector of our society and economy and see that the structures that dominated the 20th century, the giant corporations, the National Health Service, the state bureaucracies, political parties, are coming under threat from citizens self-organizing using the internet. And this is particularly clear in the case of energy. I think energy has been a leader in this field, that increasingly the centralized corporate controlled model that has dominated the 20th century is coming under severe threat from distributed systems enabling people to, I read recently a Rocky Mountain Institute report that suggested that within a decade, off-grid systems will be more competitive financially than centralized grid systems. So this gives much more opportunity for communities, particularly, again, looking to Denmark and Germany and other countries that have played a leading role in enabling communities to take ownership of a substantial portion of the renewable energy generation facilities, that this opens the door to the possibility of much more democratically controlled and owned and managed resources. I think energy is a front runner, but they're in, I think, whichever sector of society we looked at, whether it's food and farming or banking or care provision, transport, wherever it may be, that the dominant organizational forms are increasingly coming under threat from the distributed open source model.
Thank you, Jonathan. So you see this shift from centralized systems to distributed, democratically organized and in a sense self-organized systems. Ross, do you have anything to say about it?
Yes, well, I would agree that there are some tendencies in that direction. That's why I began by starting with the solar energy, which I think is the real driver behind this move towards more decentralization. But at the same time, I would like to just make a point that the opposition, which is going to be coming from the neoliberal powers that be, is going to be fantastic. I mean, I would say the elephant in the room that we often don't talk about and we don't acknowledge is I think the fact that in the United States, the 0.1%, the corporatocracy, whatever we call it, has basically taken over the political system. It's almost impossible to get elected to Congress now without having the backing of the very wealthy. So the United States, in a way, you might say, is no longer a democracy. It's become a plutocracy, a government by the wealthy. And not only that, but the leaders are basically the sociopaths. I mean, they have very little empathy with the needs of real people. And so if we're going to really make change in the future and develop strategies, I think we have to really ask ourselves the question, how do you break the back of that kind of a power structure? And this is one of the reasons I wrote my book, Occupy Wall Street. I tried to ask myself, is there a feasible strategy that could somehow change that situation? And while I think that disruption might be one possible way, I think we have to consider this current structure as meaning that we're up against a very, very powerful opponent who's not likely to give up. In spite of the fact that neoliberalism has been a total disaster in the last 35 years, with the environmental disaster, the inequality, the fact that the developing countries are not being allowed to develop and so on. But in spite of that, there's very little indication that any real change is about to happen.
Okay, so I'm hearing you don't see any real change at the kind of meta level, the large-scale political structures. They're being captured by the 1% and stifling innovation and change. while at the same time being on the wrong side of history, as some commentators have described a lot of the power structures of the United States and some of the let's not get into US BAFSing because there's also European and other capitalist interests that are keeping back this decentralized and the new economy. Let me ask another question. If you were a young entrepreneurial-minded person who's thinking about setting up and exploiting some of these new possibilities in the new economy, are there any particular areas or any particular business models you would suggest that people adopt?
Naresh, can I go back to the previous question?
Sure, go ahead.
I think, Ross, your point is absolutely right that under neoliberalism, inequality has dramatically increased. The power of the 1% has effectively meant that it's not just in the US. In many of our societies, democracy is a busted flush because the control by the financial powerhouses of the political process is such. So, in looking at this, like where could the pressure points be? Where could the leverage points be to make a change? I suspect that at the minute Karl Marx is turning in his grave and going, "I told you so." So he talked about several places where the inherent internal contradictions in capitalism that will inevitably cause its downfall, and a growing number of certainly commentators who I respect are kind of looking at what's happening from trying to gauge the dominant trends in the society at the moment, and I think are coming up with good reasons for saying that actually there are contradictions at the heart of capitalism that really are at least opening realistic possibilities that we are in a process of system change already. I just want to point to a couple of those. The first one that's most obvious is the long-term trend of the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Thomas Piketty's work here in France, looking at the statistical long-term trend, demonstrating that actually throughout the history of capitalism, with the exception of the 3 decades beginning in 1945, the gap between the rich and the poor has been exponentially growing wider, as Marx predicted it would do, ending in system collapse. A second one is, and here there's a really interesting thinker, a British journalist called Paul Mason, wrote a book called Post-Capitalism. And his very interesting observation is that we're moving into a situation where information is becoming the key resource. But information is what economists call non-rival, which means that there's no competition for it. Information wants to be shared. So if you think, for example, of the production costs, he gives this example, think of the production costs of an MP3 track from the Apple Store. Now, effectively, you're going to pay usually 99 cents or 99p for that, but really the cost is zero. Or the band makes a track and then you simply replicate for free. This is the zero marginal cost society. So in this context, with information moving more center stage as a key resource, we're moving into a situation where the need for capitalism to create artificial scarcity so it can generate profits is faced with a situation in which a non-rival, non-competitive, naturally abundant rather than scarce resource is moving center stage in our economy. So effectively, the case here is that there is a competition for space, for economic space between the corporation and the wider public, and the corporation's pool of innovation is limited to its employees, whereas with the open source, with the access to the internet, it's in competition. I can come up with some examples of this later in our conversation, of the crowd of 7 billion people effectively combining using their combined talents to provide solutions against which the corporations will not be able to compete because of the very abundant nature of information. I hope that it's kind of a complex argument. I hope I got across some of that.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. That some of the contradictions of capitalism you feel are showing up. This gap between the rich and poor, and then in the post-capitalist world, the primacy of information, zero marginal cost societies, and the need for capitalism to create relative scarcity in order for it to continue to generate profits. Ross, do you see what sort of leverage points do you see? You mentioned disruptive nature of solar energy. Do you have anything else you want to add at this point?
Yeah, well, in terms of the sort of change that could really break the back of the neoliberalism, I'd like to bring up the whole question of protectionism. Of course, no industrial country has ever gotten to where it was without having a protection of their industries until they became more competitive. And this is a kind of a naughty word among normal economists because they're thinking of it's not a good idea to protect inefficient local industries. But protectionism has a much more general meaning. It is also a positive protectionism to protect the environment, for example, to protect your culture, to protect the social structures in your country. And so I think because more and more people are beginning to become dissatisfied with the way that neoliberalism has been treating them, I think there's a good possibility that one or two countries soon are going to start turning to a protectionist strategy. In fact, this may be one of the results of the Trump decision recently to start what may become a major trade war. Because if everyone takes the same attitude, America first, Netherlands first, and so forth, we may very well see a return to protectionism, which might be a good thing for the environment. And it also it would be in line with the idea that we've been talking about decentralization. Because once you start to think about protectionism, you start thinking about producing more goods at home, import substitution. And with the idea of the energy independence of local regions, I think this would be reinforcing that trend. Imagine what would happen to the large multinationals if a number of key countries began to protect their economies from unwanted competition abroad. The EU, for example, could perhaps for the first time begin to have a really efficient form of a quota system for carbon dioxide emissions. The current system doesn't work because there's no way within the current trade treaties that the EU can put a tariff on products which are coming from the outside, which are based on a much lower environmental standard. So protectionism may very well be the key to saving the environment. And I think this is one of the things that could be a game changer.
Thank you, Ross. Ross, do you see as part of that current trend, we have what we're experiencing here in the UK, this Brexit, this idea that we're going to detach from the European community and this massive internal market, and as you mentioned, the Trump administration is also talking about protectionist measures. Do you see that as part of that trend? And in that sense, do you see it as a positive?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I noticed that the Italian elections that just took place here over the weekend are suggesting perhaps a new pattern which seems to be emerging. Brexit is, in a sense, I think, part of that. In Italy, we have, rather than the traditional sort of liberal conservative spectrum, we have on the left, we have, I would call a radical left who really wants to make real big change. And on the right, you have sort of xenophobia right-wingers who are mostly interested in keeping out the immigrants and sort of thing. So it's a totally different kind of a spectrum. And this idea of a radical left, I think we've also saw that in the last US election with the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. We saw it in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. And so I think the more and more people are beginning to realize that we have to do something really, really radical. And these parties, like the Five Star Party in Italy and the New Labour and the Democrats in the US, it looks like they may be getting a hold of something very, very significant here that can really attract, especially a lot of the young people. And I think this is a phenomenon which is likely to increase, and it's based on the breakdown of the current system. It's just not satisfying people, and they're reacting now. They're starting to react.
Great, thank you. Can I just remind participants that please post questions or comments in the chat box. I don't know if people have been. I can't see any. So I don't know, Giovanni, if there's something that I'm not doing right. But please post questions and comments as we go along. That would be really useful for the conversation. Can I?
Excuse me, Naresh. There have been a couple of comments. I don't know if you want me to look at them as you go along, or should we wait to the end?
Is there anything that might inform the present dialogue?
Well, I don't know if this will derail to a different focus, but Jenny Mead said that she would like to understand how Big Grid would work to bypass the current energy distribution systems.
Okay. Sorry, Big Grid, did you say?
Big Grid. Bit Grid.
Oh, Bit Grid. Okay. Yeah, well, that's an interesting, that in itself is a really interesting topic. I think I'm just going to hold that question. I don't know if we'll have time to get to it, but and this might actually, I don't know, we'll see what Jonathan and Ross have to say. I'd like to move now to get to something a bit more granular. Let's can we return to the question I asked earlier about if you were a young entrepreneur and were seeking to disrupt the current system, what sort of businesses or enterprises would you be looking to set up that would either create this this more localized environment that could take advantage of some of the protectionist measures that might be coming down the line, and alternatively create a more kind of sharing and economic system. Jonathan?
Sure. I'm going to be naughty and just answer the previous question before I give you a reply to that. The answer is that that actually within big grid systems, transmission losses are so great that it'd be much more efficient and cheaper eventually to do it in a smaller scale. In terms of the answer to the question you've just given, Naresh, about where for a young entrepreneur coming in, I mean, it seems to me that there's no shortage of sectors that need to be. There's no shortage of sectors in which young entrepreneurs can get involved. I mean, we talk about a post-growth society, and it's true, we need to move into a post-growth society, but there are many sectors in which there needs to be growth. So we need growth in renewable energy, in agroecology, in ecological building techniques, in so many different areas. The critical question where I'd really like to go to with the answer to this one is that the sector, I think, is less important than the enterprise type. And particularly, again, I think one of the dominant mythologies of the 20th century is the mythology surrounding the heroic individual entrepreneur. And this is largely myth. That even a study that came to the conclusion that around about 80% of the profits generated within the dominant sector are actually not as a result of entrepreneurial activities. They come from common wealth. They come from government grants. If you look at your smartphone, for example, there is so much public money that has gone into the research projects for the different components that make up the smartphone. So the heroic entrepreneur working as an individual is it's a bit of a myth. And actually, what we're beginning to see with most of the successful countercultural economic initiatives that are happening is that they're within they're within ecosystems of enterprises and other organizations that are mutually supporting. So if I can give one example, the Emilia-Romagna, this is a kind of a rather famous case study of countercultural economics. Emilia-Romagna in Italy, where the success of the dramatic success of the enterprise clusters is more to do with the relationships between the different actors in the systems. There's lots of small enterprises, cooperatives, working closely in association with their local government to create effectively a cluster, an ecosystem of enterprises in which the relationships of solidarity and mutual support between them are what gives the cluster their comparative advantage. And I think what we're seeing is a shift from focus on the individual enterprise to the relationships within the networks of support within communities that enterprises are embedded within. So for me, the answer to that question would be there's no shortage of sectors in which entrepreneurs can become involved. The critical thing is to become embedded within networks of support along the supply chain in your home region.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Well, the one I gave you of Emilia-Romagna is probably the most famous, where, or another, I've just given that example. Another is in Vermont, the food clusters in Vermont. So Vermont, state in the US and New England, celebrated for its organic and ethical food. And effectively what the local government has done in Vermont, and this is very much in the Bernie Saunders era, is to work where the local authority, the municipality, is very consciously partnering not with global capital, but with local capital. So working with the local entrepreneurs to identify what are their training needs, what are their marketing needs, what is their research and development needs, and working with them to create support organizations that would generally be embedded within multinational corporations, so that they have the various support services that they can work with each other. For example, one can get an order that's much bigger than they alone could meet, but they then subcontract to other enterprises in the network and are able to draw on the technology and research and development facilities created jointly by the small entrepreneurs and the local government.
So it's a matter of not so much the individual companies, but the networks in which they're embedded that you see.
When I look at pretty much all the success stories of the new emerging economy, the transition that is clear is the move away from the individual enterprise to the network of enterprises.
Interesting.
And not just the network of enterprises and support organizations.
Right. Okay. Ross, have you seen any interesting examples of the new economy in action that you can share with us?
Well, actually, I think there's some interesting opportunities developing with food production, especially at the local level. I think it's very much of a global trend, perhaps as a reaction to the dominance of industrial junk food. You know, more and more people are beginning to look for locally produced goods, and I think there are some opportunities here for young people to get involved. And I think people are beginning to experiment now with new forms of food production. For example, combining sort of forest gardening with permaculture and no plowing. When you begin to combine these different approaches together, we find that the actual production is much more efficient. It can be CO2 neutral, and it can be economically more advantageous than the current traditional methods. And in fact, it's even better than organic farming, which is basically another form of monoculture. And so I think there's some real opportunities in this area. And this also reinforces some of the other trends that Jonathan and I mentioned in terms of more decentralization. And so I think all of these things together are pointing in the same direction.
Maybe I can come in with another example there, Naresh, that could really help. Is something that, and again, I think what we need at the moment are people who are thinking systemically. They're looking in terms of how does the system work, rather than individual units. What are the relationships between the actors in the system? And one of the most successful illustrations of this point is the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio, where this is a very poor part of the States, where the folk trying to promote the local economy recognized that most of the money resource coming into the economy was in the procurement budget. It was what the local government was buying in terms of food, electricity, laundry services, and so on. And then saying, how can we support the emergence? And what they did in in Cleveland is they set up workers' co-ops. So they facilitated the establishment of worker co-ops that were meeting the contracts of local government for laundry services, food, electricity, I think several other things as well. And those co-ops being in association, so they're mutually supporting each other. And a case that we know of in England, Naresh, is in Preston, where they're, again, a depressed former industrial town in the north of England that has looked at Cleveland and that similarly is working with local government to try as much as possible to steer the funding that they for the procurement budget to local cooperatives. Closing the loops locally.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're kind of segueing into this a question of strategies, successes and failures, and I see what I'm hearing from both of you is that there's a creating local networks and it's the interrelationship between the networks and also the support structures, but also that there's something about thinking about which I think comes back to one of Ross's original points, is not allowing multinationals unfettered access to local markets and closing down or basically saying, well, we're going to create a series of workers co-ops that is going to capture some of the money rather than allowing the money and the resources just to flow out of those local economies to shareholders. Because as we've seen in economic development over the last 30, the sort of neoliberal model, it's very extractive. It takes money out of local economies and it concentrates wealth and in the process makes a lot of people poorer. Any other strategies that you want to touch on? We have a few minutes that we can look at. Either of you?
Well, I might just briefly mention the strategy I mentioned in my book, Occupy Brook Street, which was the idea that in order to have a solution to how to sort of break the back or have a new model for and stick to it, replace neoliberalism, that some of the smaller countries who are perhaps outside of the influence of the major countries might get together and form a new international organization. I called it the Gaia League, which was based on the idea that we have to get together if we're going to survive, and basically have an organization which seeds sovereignty in two areas. One is in the area of environmental directives, which are coming from a central organization, and the other is human rights. If these two things could be controlled centrally, then everything else could be basically decentralized. And this is the basic idea that if this model was put forward, so we have a group of countries that are saying, we're going to do this because this is what we have to do together if we're going to solve the environmental crisis and do it at the same time as respecting human rights. Then perhaps some of the larger economies like the US and the EU might be able to join, because there are very large minorities in these countries who would support this idea. And they can perhaps demand a referendum saying, let's have a vote. Why don't we join? I mean, these people are doing everything that we talk about that we have to do, but we don't actually do it. We're doing quite the opposite of what we talk about, you know. So this was one possible approach. And I think to supplement that idea of the small countries, another way this might come about is if the EU, which is an area which has the muscle to do it, if it simply declared that from now on we're going to put our first priority on the environment and only second priority on economic growth, this could change the ballgame totally. There's not much indicating right now that that's likely to happen, but it could happen, and that could be another game changer if it happens.
So you see that there's a role for large supranational organizations to take I guess in the way that the COP mechanism has done for climate change. You see there's a role for those supranational organizations to create great systems. No, okay.
I'm not talking about supranational large organizations. I'm talking about a very, very small example of maybe small countries like Costa Rica, Bhutan, and so forth, who are getting together and saying, we're going to do things differently, which is a model which is based on survival of our species, and invite others to join. That is a quite different model. But almost all major international organizations began this way, with a very small number of countries getting together and making a model and then inviting others to join.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, we have about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to throw the discussion open to others. Giovanni, do you have any, are there some comments or questions that you think would be useful to bring in now?
Well, yeah, there are a few questions.
Okay.
And let me see. There are several people have posted questions about cryptocurrency and and other alternative currencies. I don't know if you want to address that, or if you want to hear another one.
Okay. Well, Jonathan or Ross, do you have anything to say about cryptocurrencies?
I can take that one.
Okay.
So cryptocurrencies, I mean, the really interesting thing about cryptocurrencies is not the currency, it's the crypto. So really it's the blockchain. The big news is the blockchain. It's not really, I mean, certainly it's not Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a speculative currency. It's a pyramid scheme that is currently crashing as we watch. The really interesting thing is the blockchain. Now, I'm no expert in this, but from what I can see, this will prove, I am convinced, to be a critical technology in enabling citizens to, this is really ugly word. Economics is full of such ugly words, and I'm sorry, I'm going to apologize in advance for bringing this ugly word in. The ugly word is disintermediation. And what it means is that through much of the 20th century, if you've wanted to have access to critical resources, you needed to go through the mediation of a large organization. So you wanted money, you had to go through a bank. You wanted education, you had to go through the university. You wanted health services, you had to go through the state bureaucracy, and so on and so on and so on. And what we're seeing, again, through the internet is increasingly citizens being able to self-organize and get access to these resources without needing to pass through these big organizations. Big, often profit-generating, profit-maximizing bureaucracies. And the blockchain technology, my understanding of it is that it is providing a way that there is able to be mutual validation among the peers of transactions of various kinds, financial, legal, of all kinds, that are enabling citizens to self-organize independently of these large organizations, including corporations. And so consequently, I think the critical thing is, it's not the case, not the first manifestation, the first significant manifestation of the blockchain is embedded within Bitcoin, which itself is relatively uninteresting, but the potential for developing solutions of all kinds, including financial, including currencies, that are much more under community democratic control and ownership is substantial, but it's not Bitcoin.
I would agree with everything Jonathan said, but the questioner also mentioned the alternative currencies or local currencies. It's a completely different situation. And again, there are many examples around the world where alternative currencies have sprung up in periods of crisis. And I think that will continue to happen in the future. And particularly, once again, we have another factor which can reinforce this trend towards decentralization and local economies, localization, because this, again, a local currency often is only going to work in a local region, maybe up to maybe 3,000 people, that sort of order of magnitude. And so you can have actually many different alternative currencies. And by having a local alternative currency, you can do precisely what you just mentioned before, and that's a way of keeping the value which is produced in a region in the region and not having it siphoned off to the nearest financial center.
Can I have another nibble at this one, Naresh?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And it's about community currencies. I think it's a really interesting subject because my experience is that most community currencies either don't work or they work way suboptimally. And the reason, I think, is coming back to a previous point I made, is a lack of systems thinking. That actually, I think too often people begin with the idea, I want to create a community currency, and it's almost like I've got a solution, can I find a problem that matches my solution? Whereas the really successful community currencies that I see around the world are ones in which the initiators of the system have begun by really holistically, systemically looking at the range of problems facing a community, and have then created a number of different initiatives. I'll give you one example in a moment, of which the community currency is one element. So in other words, it is embedded within an ecosystem of interventions that are tailored. And so the example I was going to give is from Banco Palmas in Brazil. Lovely story from Brazil is that the government of Brazil twice took the initiators of Banco Palmas to court, saying that it was illegal for them to print money. And both times the government lost. But from what they learned in the court, they commissioned the guy who created the scheme to replicate it across Brazil. And now there are more than 100 community banks across Brazil, which have the currency as one element within their ecosystem of services, but it works because it's not a standalone silver bullet, but because it's in relationship to other interventions.
Okay, so back to that theme that you've brought to this discussion, Jonathan, about how solutions need to be embedded in systemic thinking and need to be embedded in networks of organization and people doing not doing it by themselves, but doing it with others. I also, there was a very interesting blog post by Yanis Varoufakis, who was the ex-finance minister of Greece, about cryptocurrencies, which I thought was probably the best critique I saw of not just Bitcoin, but cryptocurrencies. Giovanni, any other questions?
Yeah, there is another very interesting question about, I'll just read the question. Are there particular economic sectors or industries where protectionism will help environment the most?
Okay, interesting question.
Agriculture.
Sorry?
Agriculture, food production.
Okay.
That's probably the most important one.
Do you have any? Do you see any places that are doing that, Ross?
Unfortunately, not because of the current system. The neoliberal system makes it very, very difficult for developing countries, for example, to develop their own agricultural systems and value-added production and so forth. So
there is one celebrated case study. There is one celebrated case study, and it's not a country that chose it, but the experience of Cuba in the special period after they lost by Soviet oil meant that they were pushed through this process. So a strong recommendation for any who haven't seen it, a film called Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Pico, and watching the process of the transition of their agriculture to a locally based fossil fuel light system. Not that they chose it.
No, not that they chose it. And apparently the citizens lost an average of 20 pounds, or about 9 kilos each in the process, which probably had some health benefits as well, but we won't go into that. Any other questions, Giovanni?
A comment on decentralization vis-a-vis the power of change cascading up and down supply chain. Decentralization as a power of change cascading up and down the supply chain. Any comments? Supply chain, sorry.
I can take this one. So I really celebrate Ross's book on Occupy Wall Street, and I'm afraid I'm not at that scale, at the global scale. I'm not optimistic. I struggle to see the block of countries at that scale that would take it. So that would actually make the initiative, that would have the financial independence to be able to break free from the corrupt global governance system. So where then do I look? Like, at what scale do I see change most likely to be happening? Where is it most likely happening? And for me, this is at the municipal level. I thought it was really telling that when Trump came to power and declared that he was going to withdraw from the the COP climate change process, for example, the mayors of the 100 biggest cities in the States said, you can do what you want. We're still on track. And I'm noticing that it seems to be at the municipal level. I gave this example before of Emilia-Romagna in Italy, of the municipality very consciously partnering with local capital and civil society in making significant, substantial changes. One area, for example, in particular, is we've seen the emergence of these platforms, things like Uber and Airbnb and Google, like the giants that are dominating the online space. And now in the courts around the world, municipalities are taking these corporations to court. I mean, in fact, in London, Uber has twice lost its license. It still doesn't have its license because the municipalities, this is the level at which there appears to be, they're big enough that there's real political power, but they're small enough that they're close enough to the people, that here key alliances are being made between civil society, local business, and the municipal authority. So I think at this level, there is the potential to effect change that can go up and down the supply chain. For me, it's the most promising scale of leverage point.
So, Jonathan, you mentioned earlier in the discussion about technology, about information, the role and importance of information in this current age, and how that's going to determine a lot of the changes that we're seeing. On the negative side of that, you see increasingly companies like Google and like Uber and like Facebook who are going all out to capture those enormous amounts of data that are being produced, which are extremely valuable. Do you see any pushback against that? Although, I mean, you gave this example of municipalities who are preventing people like Uber, but at the moment, I don't see many people who are able to challenge the role of some of those large data-driven capitalist organizations, particularly like Google. Do you see anybody doing any work around that?
There's a lot of entrepreneurial and civil society kickback in terms of the platform cooperatives movement. So a recognition that cooperatives have got really good organization, they've got a good organization, they've got a couple of centuries of developing good organizational forms, but they've largely missed the importance of the open source revolution. Whereas the open sources, the hackers have got the revolution, they've understood the potential of the digital revolution, the open source revolution, but they don't have the organizational form. So increasingly the open source movement and the cooperative movement are in dialogue. And Schumacher College is one of the nodes where this is happening. To create, for example, driver platforms like Uber, where the platform is actually owned and controlled by the drivers, and they decide the rates of pay, the remuneration, sickness benefits, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a critical part of the equation, is the platform cooperative movement.
Yeah, great. Ross, do you have anything to say about that?
No, let's go on to the next question. Yeah.
Okay. So we're kind of coming to the end, so I think I'm going to probably start to wrap up. Is there any? Is there anything you'd like to say as a kind of final statement, or anything you'd like to leave us with as from this discussion? Either of you?
I would like to make one comment which I think is very topical right now, and that is you asked about monetary policy earlier on, and I think the one thing we should be thinking about in terms of a major change internationally is to adopt John Maynard Keynes' suggestion back in 1945 of a so-called clearing union. Without going into the details, the basic idea is that you can get all the liquidity that you need to finance international trade, and all the currencies will be treated equally. This system was rejected by the Americans, who wanted to have a gold-linked dollar, and that system broke down in the 1970s. And since then, we've had these floating rates, and the dollar has been the source of international liquidity for settling trade, with the result that because the dollar is the major reserve currency in most central banks, that there is not the same selling pressure put onto the dollar as in any other currency, which normally would run a deficit. The result is that the Americans have had a deficit on their trade account for 40 years. And this is a systematic factor because there's an artificial demand for the dollar, you see. And this is one of the reasons, I think, behind Trump's thinking that the foreigners have been somehow exploiting the Americans, and that's why the Americans are importing so many goods from abroad, is because the dollar is simply overvalued. And this would be an ideal solution to implement Keynes' plan. But the problem with it is for the Americans that then they wouldn't be able to buy oil with US dollars. They're the only country that can purchase oil by just printing their own currency. Every other country has to buy oil with foreign currency. But if this is implemented, it would put the U.S. on the same level as all the other countries. And so I think that it certainly would be a worthwhile innovation.
Great, thank you. Jonathan?
Yep, I just finished by saying that we're living there's this thing called proximity bias, that because we're close to things, they appear to be completely immovable. And I think there is a tendency to look at the neoliberal system and to go, how can we ever shift this? And I think it's really important to have some historical perspective here, that until the mid-1960s, the neoliberal gang were considered to be total cranks and outliers in the economics profession. It's a very recent phenomenon. And we're living that at the moment, the crises in terms of inequality, in terms of ecological dislocation, in terms of mental health, and just the crises at multiple levels are so great that there is an enormous wave of innovation that's happening. I was just reflecting as I was preparing to say this, that within complex systems, you cannot know where the spark is going to come from. So 12 years ago, you and Rob were meeting in a pub in Totnes, and 12 years later, suddenly there's a global movement. You'd never have dreamed that would have happened. And I think we can see around the world that on the one hand, there are activities and impacts of unparalleled destruction happening. And in parallel, going the opposite direction, there are myriad innovations, many of them, I think, technology enabled, but certainly not all technology enabled, and we simply can't know. We can't know where the spark is going to come from that will turn a local initiative into a global phenomenon, as with the transition movement. So we live in complex times, we live in times of transition, and we don't have the luxury of despair.
Great. Well, that's a very interesting point to end on. And I just want to say that thank you very much to both of you for participating, and thank you very much for everybody who's come to listen. And indeed, we don't know. We never know what the results of our actions are going to be. And if there's one thing that I've learned working in complex systems, is that system change can happen very, very quickly, and you never quite know how or why, but it's important to remain open to whatever emerges from whatever is happening now. So I think with that, I'm going to close the discussion. Giovanni, is there anything you'd like to say before we finish?
Yes. Well, if we are done, I would like to wrap up this event. It's been very rich indeed, and there probably are many other questions. There were a couple of other questions that people posted on the chat, but I think that they would take us into a little different direction. So because of the time limit, I think it's wise to stop it right over here. Is that okay, Naresh, or did you want anything else?
No, that's fine. Yeah. I don't know. Just leaving the space open if you want to say anything in closing as the moderator.
Right. So in closing, I'd just like to thank you all, thank the three of you for joining us in this wonderful conversation, for allowing us to join you, rather, in this wonderful conversation. Naresh, you had wonderful questions and some great way to keep the container going forward. And I appreciate that very much. Jonathan, your experience as an economist and working in different parts of Africa and Asia has really enriched this conversation. And the same thing for Russ, who has always been a wonderful light in leading us into this thinking of economics and how we can transform the world that we live in. So thank you all three very much. I would like to say to the public that our next webinar in this Glocalizer series would be with Monica Picavea. And Monica, let me say a little bit about her because she has a very interesting webinar to present on April 18. It will be, she will talk about topics of sustainability, social impact, and regeneration. And Monica has been a leading social integration. She has been leading social integration programs in Brazil since her teens. In 2016, her company, Oficina para Sustentabilidade, was elected by Be the Change as one of the best social enterprises in the world. She was nominated a Rockefeller Fellow as well with that. So I invite people to join us in the next webinar on April 18 with Monica Picavea. Just a reminder that Gaia Education works to build capacity and whole system design to unleash the emergence of local solutions to global changes. And you may find some of our products interesting, such as our books, manuals, and all of them have been published in several languages. We also have a set of SDG community implementation flashcards to help us move communities towards the Agenda 2030 of the UN. And like to remind you all again that you can also be a certified trainer with Gaia Education by following our learning journey. And you can learn more about that in our web pages if you would like. So follow us on social media. And thank you all very much for this wonderful experience.
Thank you.
Bye.